on today's show.
Well, a real key to dropping barriers in any interaction, and this dynamic applies to being taken hostage and to being in sales, is not if you know their name, but if they know your name.
Interesting. Huh.
And that's why, like, if you ever watch the TV show The Prophet with Marcus, I want to say his last name is Lemonis.
Lemonis, yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
He says, "Hi, I'm Marcus. Hi, I'm Marcus."
Right.
That's all he ever says. So your key for survivability in a hostage taking is, do they know what your first name is? And they put a gun to your head and they get ready to drag you off. You say, "Happy to go with you. You're in charge. I'm Eric." And every time they try to get you to something, to do anything, you physically comply. You'll look them in the eye and you repeat your name. "I'm Eric. I'm Chris. I'm Todd," whoever it is. And the moment you go from being hostage number one to Eric, your chances of not just surviving, but being treated much better have just now gone through the roof.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Koester.
On today's episode, we have an incredible opportunity to talk to one of the world's leading experts in hostage negotiation, Chris Voss. And the conversation is one that I would say really helped me think a lot about how we interact with others. Chris has been involved in more than 150 hostage negotiations. He's had a 24-year career as one of the lead hostage negotiators for the FBI. He's also the best-selling author of the book, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. And what was really interesting about talking to Chris is you sort of understand the process of taking the knowledge that he'd gained over a number of years as an FBI negotiator and realizing how he could apply it to so many other areas of real estate and sales negotiations and those sorts of things. And I think it's fascinating to recognize sort of the fact that when you are engaging with other humans, life's always a negotiation. And I found myself being curious about how you could apply these in a lot of different elements. He even answered my question about what to do if you really are taken hostage, which was sort of a fun part of the conversation. But Chris is someone who I think can teach a lot of us about the power of taking sort of hands-on knowledge and turning it into something that's applicable to lots of people. I think he was very surprised, as he admits on the show, just about the reach of what he's done. And his work has been profiled in dozens of talks, places from Google and the like. And I think that he shares a lot about what it's like to reach out to strangers and to be able to get them to pay attention to you. Some of the things he learned about the human psychology and using empathy as an incredibly powerful tool. So Chris is an incredible interview. I think you'll love it. And anyone that has the title Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It in the subtitle of their book has some interesting things to share. And so I'll post some other links at the end of this for some other of his interviews because we didn't have enough time to cover all the things I wanted to, but it's a favorite for mine. And I think the hope is you get out of this seeing some of the insights that you can gain from how to think about engaging with others in a way that really does create leverage for those involved and some interesting outcomes. So Chris Voss, everyone, the author of Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. All right. I am super excited to have Chris Voss joining me. And I would tell you, Chris, I've sort of become a fan. I found myself watching dozens and dozens of interviews and sessions you've had on YouTube and all over the place. And I feel like I'm a little bit like a fan now. And hopefully I can apply a few of the lessons that you share about better negotiating, because I think the biggest, toughest negotiator I have is a toddler right now. So I'm going to apply some of these things to that. So anyway, thanks a ton for spending some time with me.
Yeah, I'm honored. It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me be a guest.
You are welcome. You're welcome. So your background is fascinating. And I think your stories are so interesting to tell throughout the book that you've written. But I'm just going to let you dive into it a little bit. You are sort of one of the heads of hostage negotiation and have had all sorts of amazing experiences over a long and decorated career. But I want to hear a little bit about What is it like sort of on a day-to-day basis? I wanted to hear what it's like on a day-to-day basis when you're not in the middle of a hostage situation. What the hell do you do when you're sort of waiting for that call to come in?
All right. So, that was my old hostage negotiation life, running all the responses to every American kidnapped anywhere in the world. When I was in that, I was in it up to my eyeballs.
Yeah.
There wasn't a day that went by that I wasn't doing it because, it was enormously satisfying. So, but if something didn't happen to be cooking at the time, I breathed hostage negotiation at the time. I can remember, and I was with I think one of the biggest keys to however far I got at any given point in time was being surrounded by like-minded people.
Yeah.
Which is almost a cliche, but when I was in a unit, I was in what was in fact a very handpicked unit that was led by an extraordinarily revolutionary guy. And towards the tail end of it, one of the first people that came in after he left, that hadn't been picked by him, I remember she walked in the door and she said, "You guys breathe this stuff." And we were like, yeah. Yeah, there isn't a moment we're not talking about it, or enjoying it, or thriving on it. Sort of striving for that state of flow now, which we know from this X Games athletes is actually a thing, like what athletes would call being in the zone.
Yep.
And a book that I read recently called The Rise of Superman, which is about the state of flow, talking about how, the natural brain chemicals that our brain produces, and flow being the most addictive drug on the planet, more addictive than anything else. So when you're into what you can do and what speaks to you, you're in it all the time. I love it. You got to find, unfortunately, you got to find some ways to get away from it so you can recharge. But if you love it, it's fantastic. So what was it like for me when I was doing it? I was doing it all the time. I was surrounded by guys who wanted to talk hostage negotiation, wanted to teach it, wanted to learn it, wanted to get better at it all the time. It was the addictive state of flow.
Was there anything growing up that you look back on and think were you someone who was negotiating for late bedtimes when you were growing up? Like, is there anything that that said this is going to be my flow calling in life? Could you have known when you were young that you're looking back now that this was going to be it?
Absolutely no idea. I have searched my memory for indicators of this, and absolutely can't point. Like, my mom does not say to me, "Yeah, I remember when you were a little kid, you used to always want to try to get extra dessert," or, no indicator of that whatsoever.
And you, to the point of living and breathing it, I think I read that you were active in over 150 hostage negotiations throughout your career.
Yeah, I think, I swagged that number. Do you know what a swag is?
Oh, yeah, of course. Course.
Yeah, scientific wild ass guess.
Licking my thumb and holding it up. That's the sort of the sign, I think, towards
it's a
it.
Swag, yeah.
Yeah.
I swagged that number low just because, I'm sure that it was much more than that. I tried to guess based on the number of kidnappings I worked in Haiti, the number of kidnappings we had going simultaneously at any given point in time, and the different sieges that I was in across the country. And came up with that number. But yeah, it's actually probably higher than that, but I feel safe with saying 150.
That's good. That's listen, I think, 150 is I think that's a lot. So I think anyone who's like, just 150? Come on now. So before I dive in a little bit, I was curious about this. There's a ton of movies out there that the central premise is some type of a hostage situation or a kidnapping. Are there any sets of movies that you found to be the best sort of approximation, or they did the best job of sort of at least getting some elements, or are they all just crap to you?
No, there's pieces of films that are good. Like, we used to show pieces of the movie The Negotiator with Kevin Spacey and Samuel Jackson. Mm-hmm. They did a pretty good job overall capturing a lot of that dynamic. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing that they got really wrong, there's a scene in that where Kevin Spacey says to everybody in the command post, from now on, all decisions go through me. I'm the negotiator. All decisions go through me. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. As a hostage negotiator, one of the things you learn, which is actually enormously empowering, is commanders don't negotiate and negotiators don't command. And so when you take on an advisory role, it's very liberating, because then when you're the most informed advisor in the room, you end up steering the situation. But because you're not obligated to be in charge, then when you're on the phone, it's also liberating, because you're like, look, I can't make this deal. I'm the spokesperson. Other than that, The Negotiator was a really good movie. I also liked, from portraying the side of the bad guys in terms of kidnappings, Denzel Washington movie Man on Fire did a good job of outlining the kidnapping industry from the bad guys' point of view. You know, they look at them as professionals, as businessmen, you know, not as bad guys, but as businessmen. And that happens to be the business that they're in.
Interesting.
And that's a fair depiction of the other side.
Cool. That's fun. Well, I always thought, you know, like, it's sort of like those folks that are in whatever business, you know, there's all these people who talk about that's not how it happens. When doctors who watch the show ER, I wondered how it was for you seeing some of these high pressure situations and being like, come on now. So it's good to know there's some truth in some of these that we can learn from.
Some of them I would admit are pretty bad, but you know, those two movies have got some good stuff.
That's good. That's good. Now, I don't know if you knew this. So I am also from the mean Midwest. I grew up in Omaha, so I know that you're from Iowa and got some of your early start in Kansas City. So I have to ask, as now a guy who's sort of bi-coastal, do you miss anything from the Midwest here?
It's not that I miss the Midwest. It's that I'm grateful and thankful that I grew up there.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I think the same thing.
Yeah, and so that's how I feel about it. I find the Midwest to be like one of the most accepting places on the planet. Like the standard, when you're from the Midwest, the judgment that people make, because people make judgments everywhere.
Right.
The judgment that people make is, do you work? Will you pitch in and help? And if you're a worker and you'll pitch in, it's a roll up your sleeves culture. If you're willing to roll up your sleeves and help out, we like you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And if you're not, we don't have time for you.
Yeah. And I bet that probably plays into a lot, you know, if you're looking for anything in the history, in some ways that attitude is probably that point of like, you know, that you share, like living and breathing and being in the flow of being a negotiator, in the hostage world. It sort of does. That seems like that hard work focus, like don't take times off. You know, my parents both grew up on farms. There's no weekends when you're farming. So that kind of attitude, I think, pervades. It's cool.
Yeah. Agreed.
So I would love for you to tell a little bit about sort of your early stint. It's, you know, you got into the FBI and here you are getting into this elite world of hostage negotiation. And I read somewhere that like people believe that many of the hostage situations are sort of bank robbery related. And what you're telling, and you shared that that's actually farthest from the truth. You want to tell us a little bit about kind of what are the typical types of hostage situations that you worked on?
Well, the bread and butter for hostage negotiation really is some sort of a domestic situation that is really a relationship gone bad and somebody's waving a gun around. And that was one of the big watershed moments. Hostage negotiation across the country transitioned a couple times. You know, the creation of it was really as a result of the 72 Munich Olympics where the Israeli athletes were murdered. And people were worried about terrorist events worldwide, and there had been hostage takings and a need for hostage negotiation up to that point in time, but nobody was ever really addressing it until the terrorism thing raised its ugly head. You know, for example, the famous movie Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino. There actually weren't any hostage. That was pre-hostage negotiation. There weren't any hostage negotiation teams at that point in time. They were just kind of making it up as they went along. But what does that mean? What that means is everybody imagined they had to be prepared for terrorist events and that they needed bargaining skills. And then they found out that, all right, so we teach these guys bargaining, but bargaining's not, once we got a hostage negotiation team, bargaining situations aren't the bread and butter of what they're faced on a regular basis. They're really faced more with crisis intervention. And then so slowly, after everybody had hostage negotiation teams, they began to slowly learn that crisis intervention was really what was going on. And that then the reimagining, if you will, of hostage negotiation was really led by the FBI, my former boss, Gary Nessner, and a charismatic, dynamic guy that actually kind of changed the face of negotiation worldwide. And the majority, if not a significant amount of the negotiation teams actually changed their names from hostage negotiation to crisis negotiation. And so, you know, I came into the game, if you will, as the world was being remade into crisis negotiation. And that's where I learned it, on a suicide hotline. And I really brought it back around to these crisis negotiation skills are just emotional intelligence. They're highly sophisticated emotional intelligence. And in fact, it works phenomenally well in business situations.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what was perhaps one of the more interesting early experiences you had as a negotiator? Any kind of stories to tell to sort of give a picture of what it's like to sort of be learning on the job?
I got on the hostage negotiation team in New York because I went and volunteered at a suicide hotline. And I was just really sort of blown away about how enormously powerful those emotional intelligence skills were. And I thought, and on a suicide hotline, on the crisis hotline, not suicide, there's an interesting distinction. But they said, look, you don't need to be on a phone any longer than 20 minutes with any individual. And I remember thinking, like, 20 minutes? You got to be kidding me.
Yeah. Yeah.
On TV, they're on for hours.
Right.
But, it's empathy saves time. Tactical empathy saves time. It gets stuff done faster. It's amazing how quickly you can get to the heart of the problem and get it resolved if you use this empathy, this tactical empathy thing. And so I thought, this stuff is just too powerful. We're doing turnarounds in 20 minutes. Let's start applying this to business and personal life. So I got this heavy grounding. And then lo and behold, shortly after I become a hostage negotiator, I do end up in a bank robbery with hostages.
Really?
Which is just this extraordinarily... A bank robbery with hostages where there's negotiation happens across the entire country about once every 20 years.
Really? It's that rare?
In the entire country. It's extremely rare.
And that's one of your first times on the job. That's what you're in the middle of.
Right.
Oh, God.
So I'm falling back on my training. You fall to your highest level of preparation. And so all my prep is suicide hotline stuff. And I just go into my suicide hotline process. And I've got a bank robber surrendering to me about 90 minutes later, when the 5 hours prior to that, there was no movement. I had taken over from another negotiator, and it had been stalemated for a long period of time. And he'd been very, what we call instrumental, very bargaining, very salesman, very, very pitching, trying to get the other side to listen as opposed to listening first. And there's actually an upside to that, because if a situation is stalemated for 5 hours, you're then free to tweak it a little bit, because if it's stalemated, it's not going to go bad quickly.
Right.
That's the good thing about a stalemate, is it's not on the verge of going bad. There's no energy.
Yeah, right.
And so I drop into my suicide hotline stuff, and I got a guy out 90 minutes later.
Really?
Yeah. And so then I start teaching it more. I start studying it more. I start learning the dynamics. I was actually under observation by our full-time hostage negotiation unit at the time, although I didn't know it. They're watching how I react, because self-initiated action is a critical aspect of this. And they're just laying back to see if I start to run with this on my own without any encouragement. Because if I run with it on my own with no encouragement, then imagine what someone will do with encouragement. And that was one of the criteria, which I didn't know at the time. And can I go out and teach it? Can I explain it? Can I not only do it, but can I break it down so other people can learn it as well? And then that process just continued to build on itself. And I wanted to get smarter and get better at it. And ultimately, then I I'm determined that this stuff's got to work across the board. And that's kind of how I ended up at Harvard Law School, going through their negotiation course.
That's amazing. Did you start to see this in your day-to-day life? I mean, as you said, you live and you breathe it. Are you seeing this in how you're negotiating with, the mechanic who's fixing your car, or buying a home? Did you see these tactics applied in your own day-to-day life?
Well, I was determined to apply them. And I was determined to apply them and find out what happened. And if it needed to be tweaked, find out why it didn't work. Like the old saying in hostage negotiation was, these skills are phenomenal. Just don't use them at home.
My wife says the same thing. I went to law school, and she says, it's phenomenal that you know to think this way. Stop arguing like I'm a lawyer, right? Like,
yeah. But I remember thinking to myself, like, if this is just great human communication, why shouldn't I use it at home? Why shouldn't the people that are important to me in my life be the beneficiary of this stuff? If if it's that effective. So I thought, and then when it didn't work, I thought, all right, so what's the 2 millimeter tweak I got to make here to make it work? Because if it's not working, then then it's not that the tools are wrong. It's that my read of the application of the tools has got to adjust.
Yeah.
And so I was always determined just to make it work, because if somebody's in the darkest hour that they're calling a crisis hotline to save their own life, and I can turn somebody around in 20 minutes, then who shouldn't be the beneficiary of that?
Right. It's good for humanity, frankly. I mean, that's it's one of those skills that it's interesting. I think it's interesting. And both of us having been inside a college, there's oftentimes not a real emphasis on those types of communication, and even things like teaching empathy and teaching listening skills and teaching communication skills. The power of them is so huge, yet we spend very little time generally teaching those tools. Yeah, exactly. So so after the FBI, you get out and you're teaching these these techniques and trainings. I want to talk about this sort of decision to package it and turn it into a book. What was sort of the decision to say, all right, like I've been out there, been sharing this sort of stuff. Now it's time to actually share this in a much broader way. Well,
from the moment I left the FBI, I mean, people were encouraging me to write a book. They were saying, like, look, this is going to be a game changer for you personally and professionally. You got to get a book out there. You got to get it out. And I thought, okay, well, I believe it's going to be a game changer. I just want to make sure that we've got we're really adding to the discussion.
Right.
That we've got the process from A to Z, soup to nuts. So my teaching method at Georgetown was always making people negotiate. Proof of concept in the real world. Here's a set of skills. Here's how to apply them. Now go out and try this stuff.
Yep.
And I would take my students hostage, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't pass a class if you don't write a paper about how you tried this out.
Yeah.
So then forcing people to do it, then they would be like, holy cow, this worked.
Yeah.
I'd get a lot of papers that would say, can you believe this actually worked? And my first thought would be like, well, yeah.
Exactly. I teach a class to MBAs, and on the first day I give them each $1, and I make them go out and turn that $1 into more value by trading and talking to people. And they come back and they're like blown away that, like, oh my God, like I actually got more back. And I was like, duh, right? Like, yes, like we know this stuff works. We just have to force you to do it. So it's neat to see that happening.
Wow, that's a really interesting idea. I may steal that.
Anytime. It's all yours. It'll make them really uncomfortable.
Yeah. But anyway, and so the interesting thing about teaching this in the real world also too was, like, there are eight FBI hostage negotiation skills, the FBI 8, for lack of a better term. Now, when I came out, I was 1,000% convinced that the skill that we called in hostage negotiation, open-ended questions, that was really the primary applicable skill.
Mm-hmm.
I'd read the book before I left the FBI, Start With No, by a guy who became a friend named Jim Camp. And the bread and butter of his system are what he open-ended questions. He calls them interrogatives. And then, while the word empathy doesn't appear anywhere in his book, in layman's terms, he describes what in fact is empathy. He used to say, your negotiation has to be set in your adversary's world or you won't be successful. And that is, by definition, empathy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He just didn't learn it and study empathy, so it wasn't in his vernacular.
Right.
But I thought then the rest of the FBI 8 skills, actually the one that I thought was the least important was what we referred to in hostage negotiation as emotion labeling.
Mm.
We have found out since that the one that I thought was the least important is actually the most powerful. We call it labels. And we found it out through this laboratory, which was my course, and then interaction with the students and a lot of discussions back and forth. And I can remember a very specific moment, because we believe that there's 3 types of individuals. Your default caveman type is either fight, flight, or make friends.
Mm-hmm.
And the flight type is what we refer to as the analyst. And me as a fight type, I find them enormously emotionally draining. Those guys drive me crazy. And so the question was, all right, so how do I, as an assertive, if every word out of my mouth puts you off, how do I, as an assertive, negotiate with you effectively?
Hmm.
And I remember we pitched a specific question to a group of analysts, and I remember one of them goes like, I don't know, maybe labels. And that was like, bang. It was a total epiphany. I was like, that's it. Exactly. And we began to take a deeper dive into labels and the application. And they're actually the perfect substitute for the open-ended question. And in many cases, we've even had some real estate people tell us that the labels open the floodgates for truth-telling. And we've seen it backed up. There was a recent article about what's the best way to interrogate terrorists, whether is it harsh interrogation or is it the rapport-based interrogation that the FBI has always been 1,000% supporter of. And there's finally data now out there. And one of the conclusions from this data study, a rigorous, academically acceptable study, they described rapport-based empathy as the closest thing to truth serum that law enforcement has. And when you lie, and I know what that means because I've had people in business say this skill unlocks the floodgates of truth telling. Right. That's another way of saying giving someone truth serum. How do you open up the truth as if you've given them a serum? And it's through this tool of labels, which I didn't even think was important when I first started this journey in the business world. And
give it sort of a tactical example of labels. Where. Whether you want to negotiate with me or you just want to generally talk about it, what's the way that tool is effective as a negotiation trick in life?
Well, all right. So I'll put it in a couple different contexts. And the one context that the person stated this for us was in showing open houses to potential real estate clients. And somebody walks through an open house, you let them in, you point some stuff out, and they walk around, they look around at stuff. And typically a real estate agent will say, well, what did you think? Which is, a good open-ended question should start with the word either what or how. Those are the two critical words. And so what did you think should be a good question. And they would get, well, we saw a couple things we liked. And they get a short answer and a person would leave. Because the mere construction of a question causes people to hesitate in their response.
Interesting.
To some degree, regardless.
Yep.
Some people, they become enormously hesitant. Some people only slightly hesitant. But something about the construction of that and the way it hits the emotional architecture in the brain. So the same real estate agent I'm teaching labels, and the same person walks out and they look at them and they say, seems like you saw some stuff you liked, which is just a label. Seems like they're labeling a dynamic.
Interesting.
And when they say that, instead of getting a short, well, we saw this and that, people go, oh, yeah, we saw this and we saw this. And we're thinking about this room for our kids and we got a dog, or we're thinking about this room for the kids we hoping to have.
Interesting. Yeah.
And literally the floodgates of truth telling is unlocked.
Just with that simple tweak.
And there's something about the specific design of the label as I expressed it that bypasses some of the barriers to response and gets straight into a thought process where the floodgates are opened up. The other important thing about this is, because a lot of people are taught active listening, and they're taught to say, well, what I'm hearing is...
Yeah, that's right.
Now, there's two things wrong with that. The word what is involved.
And I.
And the word I is involved.
Yeah.
And both of those words hit the brain in a different way. And the label, as we teach them, drops both of those words out very intentionally. And the simplicity of the design can actually be misleading, because the simplicity of the design is designed to get past barriers in thought patterns.
So my wife often jokes, we travel periodically internationally. We've traveled to some places that are a little rough. She's always like, she's always role playing with me. Now, what do we do if we're getting a hostage situation? So how do I apply that if the terrible comes true and my wife forever right? Like how do you apply that then in a situation that's more intense? Like not showing a house, but now you are in a place that's like sort of uncomfortable and you're in that situation.
Well, a real key to dropping barriers in any interaction, and this dynamic applies to being taken hostage and to being in sales, is not if you know their name, but if they know your name.
Interesting.
And that's why, like, if you ever watch the TV show The Prophet with Marcus, I want to say his last name is Lemonis.
Lemonis, yeah. I'm a big fan.
He says, "Hi, I'm Marcus. Hi, I'm Marcus."
Right.
That's all he ever says. So your key for survivability in a hostage taking is, do they know what your first name is? And they put a gun to your head and they get ready to drag you off. You say, "Happy to go with you. You're in charge. I'm Eric." And every time they try to get you to something, to do anything, you physically comply. You'll look them in the eye and you repeat your name. "I'm Eric. I'm Chris. I'm Todd," whoever it is. And the moment you go from being hostage number one to Eric, your chances of not just surviving, but being treated much better have just now gone through the roof.
Wow, that's amazing. You're at the core, even if we see these folks as adversaries, be it in a hostage negotiation or as in a sales scenario, right? At the core, we're humans. And I think that like when we cut these things down to humans as opposed to transactions or numbers, it does change the whole dynamic. I'm just like now replaying through times where I've felt good when someone says their name to you, like, or your name. You're right. Like it's a simple thing. And I think in some ways we lose sight of the importance of saying someone's name.
Yeah. And again, it's, do they know your name? Like,
right.
Another real estate guy I was coaching a while back, he says, "We got problems. People are not returning our phone calls and not returning our emails." And he said, and I make so much effort to get to know them. And I said, "That's exactly what you're doing wrong." And he goes, "What?" I go, "Say that again." He goes, I make a lot of effort to get to know them." I said, "Yeah. And that means that they're not getting to know you." And he went like, "Oh, wow.
Interesting."
They know. Yeah. He's all his effort on getting to know them. And he never went from being business person to Todd.
Right. You're sort of it's as I shared with you before, I was a lawyer at one time. And I always found that to be really interesting is that if I didn't introduce myself as a lawyer, because I found it was never valuable. If they knew me as Eric and that I happened to be a lawyer at the time when I was practicing, it was much more valuable than the other way around. And I think I never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. It's labels can have the sort of the inverse effect when they label you as that role as opposed to as a human who you are. Fascinating.
Right.
Super interesting.
Yeah. It changes everything.
And so I want to talk a little bit about the book. And it's, it's in some ways, I think it's been one of these things that has, it's brought you to a lot of places. You've got over 1,000 reviews. Did you ever kind of anticipate this book would have this kind of a sort of hit this kind of a seam in the world when you were publishing it? No, of course you hope, you have a very high hope for it. And to the process, up into like when my agent put the book out there, I expected very little response in terms of publishers, because a lot of people, human beings are trained to be naysayers. Yes, and so I came across some agents that were like, there's 1,000 books on the market. Or my agent actually, he said, I'm not sure what kind of a reception we're going to get domestically, but this FBI stuff is really popular overseas, and I know I can get you a lot of book deals overseas, which he did. Guy's name is Steve Voss, and Steve is a phenomenal agent. I've been so happy with Steve. But we did not expect that there would be this much appetite. Yeah. Or that it would be this different, or even that people would read it and they would be like, "Holy cow, I made a difference today, and I've only read the first chapter." Yeah. And an awful lot of that had to do with my co-writer, Tal Raz, being an extraordinary writer. But no, we didn't expect that it would hit as hard as it hit, or that it would really meet a need that nobody knew was there. We see that consistently. Like if I approach somebody about speaking at their conference, they'll be like, "Our membership's not asking for negotiation. That's not on their list of asks." Right. And then I'll walk in the door and it'll be standing room only. Yeah. And they'll be like, "Holy cow, we didn't expect this." Like the first major conference I spoke at, initially they're going to put me in a room that would only hold about 100. And then they started getting interest expressed in an overwhelming fashion. It was a conference that had 6,000 people. They put me in a room that could hold 500.
And then when they shut the doors because they thought the fire marshal was going to get mad at them because so many people were standing in the room. And they came up to me afterwards and they said, we could have filled the room with 750 people. And they had no idea because they regularly surveyed their attendees and nobody ever said anything to them. They wanted anything about negotiations.
Right.
So it was understandably, they had no idea the appetite was there. So it's understandable why nobody knew that the appetite was there this strong for it, but it's hit really hard.
I think one of the things that I would say, just because there is a bunch of books like Getting to Yes and Getting to Maybe, and there's a lot of those ones out there. I think one of the things that I found interesting about it, and again, I've taken some negotiation classes in college and law school. It's interesting that you have some contrarian sort of perspectives. And I think that was one of the things that was interesting. I mean, I think even, you say some things that sort of stand out to people, like, people are not rational and there's sort of, and like, don't look to compromise and sort of these things. What is it about those elements that I think they're so important in negotiators that people think about that sort of is contrary to the popular perspectives?
Yeah, well, the popular perspectives, like Getting to Yes, which has always sort of been everybody's standard. Mm-hmm. It's intellectually sound.
Right.
People are rational.
Yep.
And if you study negotiation and, on the one hand, reading that book is like reading the dictionary. I mean, if you need to fall asleep at night, try to read that book.
Super boring.
But you can read it in small doses and you cannot challenge rationally anything in it. And I can remember when I read it and handed it to some of my hostage negotiators, they were going like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And not one of them could apply it. Not one. Mm-hmm. I don't know anybody who said, while I was Getting to Yes, I turned around and I made a great deal because of it. Nobody's ever, that's not to say that there aren't people out there that could say that. It's just none of them ever said it to me. And I've spoken to a lot of people, but and I met Roger Fisher. And he was in an academic environment. Roger Fisher's emotional intelligence is actually through the roof. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But because he was an academic, they had to write a book that conformed to their academic environment, which is all about rationality. Yep. And human beings, and I still get arguments from people about how that they're rational and they're not emotional. Mm-hmm. And ultimately I can run a couple exercises with them that prove that that's not true. And then the best I can get out of them are like, okay, so everybody else is emotional, but I'm the one rational person.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's right. But not me.
Yeah. So, all right. So if you're rational, everybody else is emotional. Mm-hmm. And it's a whole different set of rules. And if it is a different set of rules, the best tools are tools that were designed from the original premise that people aren't rational, which is hostage negotiation tools.
That's amazing. So what has been the thing that's, you've been invited to speak tons of different places. What has been some of the most surprising thing that's happened as a result of publishing this book? Because it is, basically there's certain things I don't even bother asking because I would just share people. There's like so many great interviews of you out there. What's the thing that surprised you the most in this sort of adventure of publishing your book? I've
been really surprised about how people in different industries, somebody smart will pick it up and just start hitting home runs right away. And not everybody can do that.
Yeah.
We're collaborating. My company's collaborating with a company called Node, which is an artificial intelligence company that's backed by Mark Cuban. Mm-hmm. And the CEO is Fallon Fatmi. And Fallon's brilliant. And she's the new face of the not just the American CEO, but the international CEO. Mm-hmm. Young, dynamic, brilliant, beautiful woman who can be a kick-ass business person and not sacrifice her femininity to do it. Mm-hmm. I saw it more in law enforcement, and I think it probably happened in the business world too, is women were coming up in the executive ranks in law enforcement. They thought they had to be men and act like men, and it was against their nature, and it consumed them, and they weren't successful by it. One of the things that I'm really encouraged about by these days is women can show that they can be ridiculously successful and not need to be one of the guys. And Fallon is one of those people. And she started applying it immediately to their recruiting emails. And they went from getting zero response in their recruiting emails because coders and engineers in Silicon Valley are the rock stars. Everybody wants them. So you'll send out an email to somebody that you want to recruit, and they just won't answer.
Yeah.
And they went from getting 0 response on their emails to getting an 80% response rate just by applying the stuff from the book. And I didn't. It's a negotiation book. It's not a recruiting manual.
Right, exactly.
But she's using it as a recruiting manual.
Yeah, the principles apply to
Or the real estate people are using it in real estate, or the sales people are using it in sales. Mm-hmm. All you got to do is be open to new ideas, and you immediately begin to see application of the ideas in your work.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great segue on that. I want to ask you a question on that one. So a lot of the people that are watching this or that I'm teaching, one of the biggest things that I teach people, particularly when they're creating their own book or they're creating a podcast or whatever it is one of the biggest things is they have to get strangers to talk to them. So there's this process of, reaching out to a CEO of a company to interview for your book or to talk to you about whatever it is. What are some of the tips or techniques that you would give to someone to sort of be able to be more successful at engaging with strangers, being able to connect with people, making those sorts of connections more personal, more meaningful? How would you think about teaching someone to sort of be more successful at opening themselves up to meet new people and people you want to meet?
Well, yeah, and I'll teach from the other side because I'm getting constantly approached these days.
Yeah.
And if somebody approaches me like, "Hey, hire me, give me," I thought it'd be nice to connect.
Yep.
If they start with an ask,
right,
and every now and then I'll say, "Okay, well, sure, happy to help you out. But lay something of value on the table for me, anything."
Right.
And if their answer is like, "Well, I'm what's of value, and I'm making myself available to you."
Yeah.
Like if anybody approaches me with any idea whatsoever of what I might find valuable.
It's interesting. Like
if I get an email back that says, I loved your book and I gave you a 5-star review on Amazon. I'm like, oh, interesting. You went first.
Yeah.
You risked getting nothing in return, and you were smart enough to take an educated guess on what might be valuable to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, now I'll talk to you. So if you even try to do anything for me first, my latitude towards you, the amount of rope I'm willing to give you, and the benefit of the doubt I'll give you is 1,000 times more than somebody who just approached me with a cold ask.
Yep. Yep.
Like, my asset is me, and I'm making me available to you.
Right.
With no thought whatsoever of even asking if there's something they could do for me.
Yep. Yeah.
That makes it 1,000%. I mean, I get an email today from someone who appears to have great negotiation credentials in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And her approach was, I'm valuable. I'm making myself available to you.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't even know that I'm going to respond to that.
That's right. That's right. Have you seen the Adam Grant TED Talk on givers and takers?
I'm a huge Adam Grant fan, and I have not seen that TED Talk.
It reminds me a lot of what he premises in there. The TED Talk is short. It's only like 12 minutes, I think, maybe. But there's a section in there that I use a lot that reminds me exactly of this called the 5-minute favor. And what it talks about is exactly that. Like too many people ask first and then sort of like hope that like the other person on the other side is just generous by proxy. And so what he says is like, listen, just do a 5-minute favor for someone. Like you said, leave them a review, donate to their charity, write to something like, so I use a lot of that exact same things of like, just be thoughtful, like first. And if it at least will open the door of them to pay attention to you, particularly if they're busy. And so I think there's something psychologically that Adam Grant sort of leads this world of like givers, takers, and matchers. And what I shared with the students is almost what you said there is if you start out as a taker, hey, I want something, you basically shut yourself off from 75% of people who are either matchers or takers. And maybe you get lucky 1 in 4 times with the giver. And in this case, if you start out with here, I did something first, at least you flip that to where 75% of people should at least be receptive to you. So sort of interesting sort of psychological background based on that exact response you gave.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, very well said.
I don't know if it was well said. I just stole it straight from Adam Grant, who I think sounds like both of us are fans of. So kudos to Adam.
Hey, look, well, I remember hearing a saying a while back, the only person to ever claim to have a truly original thought was Adam.
That's good. There you go. It's good. Now we got it right there. I love it. Well, I want to be respectful of your time and wrap up with a couple quick fast ones for you that I like to ask. So first off, I think just to plug it, I love this book, and I'm a fan, and I'm going to start basically recommending more pieces of it to my students, because I do think you're absolutely right. Like, there's a sense here of applying it and using it as a way to open doors, which I think is great. So kudos to that. And God love you. Any book that has over like 1,000 5-star reviews must have something in it that's worth reading.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let's end on one last thing. What's the one piece of advice for someone negotiating salary that you'd give? Take
your focus off salary and put it on to the success of the company, and they'll never be able to pay you enough.
Interesting. It's great. I think it's especially for people early on. I think it's a short-term play to think about salary versus like, what are you going to learn? And that learning will turn into more value down the road.
And if I can real quickly, a friend of mine, another small town boy from Iowa, his name is Tom McCabe, and he's the head of the U.S. for the Development Bank of Singapore. So it's an international bank, and he's the head of country in the U.S. Tom has, from nowhere to the head of an international bank, has always focused on, he said, in every job review and in every interview he's ever had, how can I be guaranteed to be involved in projects that are critical to the strategic future of the company?
Yeah.
Which gives him, he's in the middle of stuff that matters all the time.
Yeah.
He's got visibility with the highest echelons of the company. His success is their success. Now, he hasn't had a perfect career. Nobody does.
Right.
But he's the most successful person that of the people that I know well. His success is insane. On top of that, everybody that works for him are always involved in critical projects. And interestingly enough, he's got a reputation in his industry. He pays slightly less than the top of the market. He's not a top payer, and he retains people longer than anybody else in his industry because they love working for him so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's all about creating future. And if you're focused on creating future, it's not infallible. Nothing is, but it's the highest success rate of anything out there that I've seen.
Yeah, I give a very similar piece of advice. I think right on with that, and say, don't necessarily pick a great company, but more pick the person you want to work for and the projects you want to work on. And if you can make sure that you've got sort of the person who's going to mentor you and help give you challenging projects, you're way more likely, especially early in your career, to actually grow to get the next. You want to sort of make sure you're thinking about these early jobs as investments that are going to basically, be exponentially valuable as opposed to like sort of incrementally valuable.
Yeah. Agreed. I think that's great advice.
I love it. Well, Chris, this is so awesome. I appreciate your time so much. And I hope that we can continue to have these kind of conversations. And like I said, I'm a big fan of this one. And I'm going to make part of this required reading for my students who have to negotiate with people to get them in their books or a podcast or whatever it is, because I think those types of skills just aren't taught enough.
My pleasure. And yeah, we will continue these conversations. Thanks, Eric.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Chris.